For 9 long years, Eli Warner had lived alone beneath the sandstone cliffs of the high frontier. He built his cabin with his own hands, split from pine logs, dragged by mule across 3 ridges. His water came from a spring-fed stream behind the canyon wall. His food mostly jerky, beans, and hard bread. He either hunted or traded for once every few months when he rode into the distant town of Dry Creek. No neighbors, no letters, no visitors. And that was just how he liked it. Once, long ago, he'd worn a blue coat, rode with the army, tracked through the desert for months on end, and seen too much death to count. He'd been young, sharpened, with a fire in his chest and the illusion that violence meant justice. But war had a way of stealing more than it gave. The day he found his brother's body near a burned-out camp, scalped and riddled with arrows, that fire died for good. And so did any trust he had in orders, flags, or the cause. He never blamed the Apache. Not really. They were defending their land, just like he had defended his brother. The real blame lay somewhere deeper, harder to define, a web of broken treaties, greedy land barons, and commanders who sent boys to die for things they didn't understand. So Eli left the fight behind. He took what savings he had, bought a horse, and rode west until the land felt empty enough to bury his memories. The place he found, tucked beneath the red cliffs and wrapped in blue sky, had no name on any map. He'd seen an eagle circle above it once and decided that was enough. He stayed, he built, and he let the world forget him. His days were simple and repetitive. Wake before dawn, feed the mule, check the traps, fix the fence posts. Sometimes, he'd whittle small wooden carvings and place them along the porch, a habit he didn't even know he had until a row of faceless figurines stared back at him one day. At night, he read from a Bible worn thin, or just sat on the step with a pipe and listened to the coyotes howl. Some days he spoke no words at all, and yet, despite his resolve to stay alone, there were moments when the silence felt too thick. When he'd wake from dreams of laughter and a woman's voice, one he couldn't quite place, only to find the fire cold and his bed empty. He told himself it didn't matter. People meant pain. People meant betrayal. Better to stay with the wind and wood, where nothing lied. It was early autumn when everything changed. The air had turned crisp, and a light frost rimmed the edge of his cabin roof. Eli had just returned from checking snares deeper in the valley when he noticed something strange. Faint tracks near the edge of the porch. Not animal, human, small. Fresh. He gripped his rifle tight, every sense suddenly awake. Someone had been near, and recently. As he stepped onto the porch, a soft sound reached his ears. Not a word, more like a scrape and a thud. Cautiously, he edged toward the door, and there she was, slumped against the weather-worn door. Barely upright was a young Apache girl, not yet a woman, but close. Her long black hair was tangled and matted with blood. Her right arm hung limp. A deep gash soaked through what was left of her deerskin sleeve. Her face was pale with exhaustion, her lips cracked from thirst. She blinked once, saw him, and in a voice hoarse from pain, whispered something he didn't understand. Then her knees buckled. Eli caught her before she hit the ground. For the first time in nearly 10 years, someone had touched his door, and that someone had just collapsed in his arms, bleeding and broken. The silence of the frontier was shattered. Eli Warner didn't hesitate. As soon as the Apache girl collapsed at his doorstep, he scooped her up in his arms. She was light as a bundle of sticks, cold to the touch, and burning with fever. Her skin was damp with sweat, but her lips were pale. Blood trickled down her arm from a deep wound, and her breathing came in short, ragged gasps. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, laying her gently on his small hard cot by the fireplace. It wasn't much, just a wool blanket and a straw mattress, but it was the warmest place he had. The girl didn't stir, only muttered something in a language he didn't understand. Her head lolled to the side. Eli's heart pounded. For 9 years, not a soul had crossed his threshold. And now, out of the blue, a wounded Apache girl had appeared like a ghost. He didn't know who she was, or where she'd come from, or what had happened to her. But the blood on her arm, and the terror frozen on her face told him enough. She was running from something, or someone. He grabbed a clean rag and a bowl of water from the corner. Carefully, he wiped her forehead, removing the sweat and dirt. Her skin was hot, too hot. She was burning up. He examined the wound on her arm, tearing away the torn buckskin sleeve to get a better look. The gash was deep, possibly from a knife or an arrow. It needed stitching. Eli hadn't touched another person in years, let alone tended to one. But the old army habits came back quickly. He opened his medical kit, one he'd kept since his cavalry days, and pulled out a small bottle of whiskey, a sewing needle, and thread. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but they worked. He cleaned the wound, poured a bit of whiskey over it, and began stitching. The girl flinched unconsciously, but didn't wake. Each time the needle pierced her skin, a little part of him winced too. When the wound was closed, he wrapped it with clean cloth and tied it snug. Her breathing stayed shallow, but steady. Once she was bandaged, Eli placed another blanket over her and fed more logs into the stove. The fire crackled, pushing away the cold that clung to the corners of the cabin. Outside, wind howled through the trees. Night was falling fast. He sat down in the rocking chair across from her, his rifle propped beside him. The only sound was the ticking of the old clock and the girl's faint breathing. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone, and it unsettled him. Eli studied her face as she slept. Beneath the smudges of dirt and the dried blood, she was young, maybe 16 or 17, and strikingly beautiful. Her high cheekbones, long dark lashes, and full lips reminded him of someone. Maybe someone from the past. Maybe someone from a dream, but this wasn't a dream. This was real. And now she was here, in his home, wounded and helpless. He wondered who she was running from. Had she escaped a raid? Was she being hunted? Was she lost? And more importantly, would someone come looking for her? Eli leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on her face, questions racing through his mind. But one thing was certain, he couldn't turn her out. Not now, not in this state. The frontier was unforgiving, and she wouldn't survive a night alone. Hours past the fire died down. He tried to doze, but sleep wouldn't come. Just before dawn, she stirred. A soft sound escaped her lips. She turned her head, opened her eyes for a fleeting second, and whispered something he couldn't understand. A name, perhaps. Then she drifted back into unconsciousness. Eli sat forward. For the first time in 9 years, someone had spoken inside his cabin, and it shook something loose inside him. Morning broke over the prairie with a pale light that crept through the slats in Eli's cabin walls. The fire in the stove had long died out, and the room was cool again. Eli hadn't slept. He sat in the same wooden chair beside the girl, one hand cradling a lukewarm tin mug of coffee, the other resting on the stock of his rifle, just in case. She hadn't stirred all night, except for that one whisper, that one name he couldn't make out. But now, as the morning sun stretched its fingers across the cabin floor, the girl moved. It started with her brow twitching, then her eyelids fluttered. She coughed weakly and turned her face into the pillow. Her lips moved again, barely parting, dry and cracked. Eli stood up, slow and cautious. He poured some water into a tin cup, knelt beside her, and lifted her head gently. "Here," he said, his voice low and unused. "Drink slow." Her eyes blinked open, just slits at first, dark and wary. She saw him, froze, and her body tensed. Her hand reached for something at her side that wasn't there. A knife. Maybe reflex. Instinct. "It's all right," Eli said quickly, backing up just a step and setting the cup down on the nightstand. "You're safe. You're in my home. No one's gonna hurt you." She stared at him, a hard, suspicious stare. Eli could tell she was trying to decide whether to trust him or bolt for the door. But then her eyes flicked to her bandaged arm, then to the steaming cup of water. Her gaze softened, if only slightly. "You were bleeding bad," he said. "I stitched it up. You'll be all right." Still, she didn't speak. Her eyes roamed the room, taking in every exit, every object. The stove, the rifle, the door. Finally, she propped herself up slightly with her good arm and reached for the cup. Her fingers trembled as she drank. "Name's Eli Warner," he offered. "Don't reckon you care, but figured you ought to know who helped patch you up." She lowered the cup and looked at him again. Then, after a long pause, she spoke. When the word was soft, her voice hoarse. "That your name?" Eli asked. She nodded once. He repeated it slowly, trying not to butcher the sound. "Winia," another nod. Her expression still held caution, but her body was relaxing, bit by bit. The danger was ebbing, but it wasn't gone. Eli pulled a small loaf of cornbread from the shelf and broke off a piece. "Hungry?" Winia hesitated, then nodded again. He handed it over, and she accepted it with her good hand, chewing slowly, silently. She ate like someone who hadn't had a proper meal in days, careful, restrained, but with the urgency of someone whose stomach was in pain. Eli sat back down in the chair. He didn't press her with questions. Not yet, there'd be time for that later. Right now, she needed to know she wasn't in danger. Still, as he watched her eat in silence, the questions grew heavier in his chest. Who had wounded her? What had she been running from, and how far had she come to land at his doorstep, a half-dead stranger on the cold prairie? Winia finished the bread and leaned back against the pillow, her eyes now studying him more openly. She wasn't afraid, not exactly, but there was a wall between them, a language, a history, a lifetime of mistrust that no bandage or loaf of bread could erase. But Eli had seen enough men bleed to know one thing. Survival came before stories. She needed rest, food, and shelter. And for now, he could give her that. "You can stay till you're strong enough to walk," he said simply. "No one comes out this far. You'll be safe." She didn't reply. But she didn't argue either. That night, as the stars blinked awake in the sky and coyotes howled somewhere beyond the hills, Eli noticed something different. The silence didn't feel as heavy as it used to. The days passed slowly, and the girl named Winia began to heal. Eli kept to his chores, feeding the horse, chopping wood, patching fence lines, but his rhythm had changed. Where he once spoke to no one for weeks, now he found himself checking the cabin every hour, listening for movement, waiting to see if she'd need water, food, or just another fire log tossed into the stove. Juanita said little. She kept her words short and quiet, watching Eli with eyes that held stories she wasn't ready to tell. But each day, she regained strength. The swelling in her arm went down. The fever faded, and by the fourth morning, she stood on her own, 2 feet, her long black hair falling over one shoulder like a river of ink. You should rest more, Eli said, noticing her at the doorway, steadying herself against the frame. I need air, she said, voice rough but sure. Then she stepped out onto the porch and took in the prairie, endless skies, tall grasses swaying in the breeze, the scent of pine drifting down from the nearby hills. Eli stayed behind, giving her space. He didn't want to press her, didn't want to ruin the fragile peace that had settled between them. Still, he watched from inside as she turned her face to the wind and closed her eyes like she was listening for something old and far away. That afternoon, they sat at opposite sides of the small wooden table and shared stew in silence. Eli was used to silence, but with her, it felt different. Not lonely, just waiting. Where are you from? He finally asked, voice low. Wah. Naya didn't look up from her bowl. South, near the Black Ridge. My people call it Tacha. White men call it Devil's Spine. Eli nodded. He'd heard of it, a jagged range of hills that cut across the land like broken teeth sacred to the Apache, cursed by settlers. You've got family there? He asked. Her hand paused halfway to her mouth. She set the spoon down. Not anymore. A long silence followed. Eli didn't ask again. Later that evening, as the sky turned purple with dusk and coyotes began to yip in the distance, Juanita sat by the fire and began to hum, soft, mournful, and low. Eli sat in his chair, sharpening his knife, listening. What's that song? He asked after a moment. She stopped. My mother's, for crossing into the spirit world. Eli said nothing, just nodded, and went back to his knife. The next morning, Juanita was gone. Eli woke early, like he always did, but the cot was empty. The door had been pushed open, and her tracks led out into the frost-covered prairie. Panic surged through him, not fear for himself, but fear for her. She wasn't ready to be walking far, not with that wound, and she sure as hell couldn't defend herself out here. Not with no weapon, no food, no horse. He saddled up and rode out. He found her an hour later, standing alone in a clearing at the base of a hill. She didn't flinch when he approached, just turned her head slightly as he rode up beside her. You looking to disappear? He asked. She didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on something far away, a distant smudge of smoke curling into the sky. Maybe a campfire, or something worse. They're coming, she said at last. Eli narrowed his eyes. Who? My people. Or what's left of them, and maybe others too. She looked up at him. What you did for me. It won't go unnoticed. Eli didn't move. The wind picked up, rustling the dry grass around them. Do I need to be worried? He asked, careful. She met his eyes with something between warning and gratitude. No, she said, but you do need to be ready. And with that, she turned and started walking back toward the cabin, leaving Eli staring at the smoke on the horizon and wondering just how much his life was about to change. For the next 2 days, Juanita barely spoke. She stayed close to the cabin, sharpening sticks into spears, sorting through Eli's small stash of supplies, and scanning the horizon every few hours like a scout in hostile territory. Something had shifted in her. The wounded girl, who once flinched at a creaking floorboard, now stood watch with the tension of someone expecting war. Eli noticed. You got people tracking you? He asked her one evening, as she sat on the porch, cleaning her arm with a cloth dipped in boiled pine water. Wah. Nia didn't look up. Yes, and others who aren't my people. He leaned on the doorframe, arms crossed, meaning, she sighed. Before I found your cabin, I was running. Soldiers raided a winter camp near the river. Not white men, Mexican irregulars, bounty hunters, they killed indiscriminately. My brother was among them. Her voice faltered. Just for a second. Eli didn't interrupt. I escaped with 2 others. We scattered. I don't know if they made it. I ran north. I bled for 3 days through the snow. And then your door. Eli looked down at the worn porch floor. You think they followed your trail? They were close. And if they're not dead, they're still coming. That night, Eli sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees. He didn't sleep. By morning, he'd reinforced the cabin door, rechecked every round of ammunition, and made 2 more knives from sharpened wagon springs he'd kept in the shed. It had been years since he'd prepared for a fight, but it came back to him easily, too easily. Wani. Ya watched him silently, approving. Around midday, a dust cloud appeared on the southern ridge. Eli spotted it first. He was feeding his horse when the sun caught the faint, shifting trail, like smoke, but heavier. He grabbed his scope, climbed to the roof, and looked. Riders. 5. Maybe 6. Moving slow, but steady. He climbed down and found Juanita already, preparing a bow she'd fashioned from ash wood and elk sinew. Friends of yours? He asked. They ride too openly for Apache. Too loud. They don't expect resistance. Bounty hunters, she nodded, or worse. Eli loaded his rifle. They picked the wrong cabin. By dusk, the riders were close enough to see with the naked eye shadowy figures against the golden prairie. Long coats, slung rifles, one with a red scarf around his neck. They dismounted about 50 yards from the cabin and approached on foot. Eli and Wania crouched behind the stacked firewood wall he'd built earlier. The air was heavy with tension, the only sound, the low whistle of wind through the grass. Then, one man stepped forward and called out, "House belongs to Eli Warner." His voice was smooth, confident, the kind that had practiced lying. Eli rose slowly, rifled at his shoulder. "Might be, depends who's askin'." The man smiled. "Name's Captain Vargas. We're here under federal contract. There's an Apache, fugitive reported in this territory, dangerous, armed. Last seen heading north." When he tensed beside him, Eli called back, "Ain't seen no Apache round here. Just jackrabbits and snow." Vargas chuckled. "I think you're lying, Mr. Warner. You think what you want," Eli said. "You got no warrant, no right. You set one boot past that fence, you'll be leaving with fewer teeth than you came with." The other men shifted, hands inching toward their holsters. Wania rose beside Eli, bow drawn. "You've got 10 seconds, she said, voice ice. Captain Vargas narrowed his eyes. "You're harboring a fugitive. That makes you an accomplice." Eli's rifle didn't move. "And you're trespassing on my land with bad intentions. That makes you target practice." The standoff stretched for a long breath. Then Vargas gave a tight smile, turned to his men, and jerked his head. They backed away slowly. "This ain't over, Warner," he called. "She's worth 500 dead or alive." "Then you better bring more men next time," Eli said. The bounty hunters mounted up and disappeared into the fading dusk. Eli turned to Wania. She exhaled slowly and lowered her bow. He nodded. "We'll have to be ready. They'll come again." Wania didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "For the first time," she said quietly, "I'm not running alone." The next morning brought a strange stillness, the kind Eli had learned to trust as a warning. The prairie lay frozen under a soft dusting of snow, and the wind had died completely, leaving the world hushed. Watchful. Eli was up early, checking tracks and looking for signs that Captain Vargas and his men might have doubled back under cover of darkness. He found nothing, no hoof prints, no broken brush, not even a coyote. But that worried him more than seeing the bounty hunters again. Nature had gone quiet. Back at the cabin, Wania was already packing supplies into a worn leather satchel. Dried meat, root bundles, even the small clay pot they used for boiling herbs. "You planning to run again?" Eli asked. She didn't stop moving. "No, but we shouldn't be here when they come back." Eli leaned against the doorway. "They'll come in greater numbers. You think they will? They won't take a threat like you lightly. You embarrassed them?" Eli gave a dry smile. Wasn't hard. But the humor didn't last. Wania pulled a small beaded pouch from her pocket, an item he hadn't seen before, and set it carefully in the satchel. "This belonged to my mother," she said quietly. "I buried it under a tree years ago. When I ran after the raid, I went back for it." Eli nodded, saying nothing. She glanced up at him. "I don't want to lose anything else." He understood. He'd lost too much himself, a wife to pneumonia, a son to fever, a family to war, and all he'd had left was this cabin, this silence, and the prairie wind. Until her. By mid-morning, they had packed everything they could carry. Eli secured his old hunting rifle across his saddle. Wania slung her bow and a quiver of arrows across her back. They rode side by side into the open land, heading toward the hills in the distance. Wania guided them toward a canyon she knew well, narrow, hidden by rock formations, with a stream that never fully froze. "My people call this place what?" she said. "It means where the earth watches." It felt like the earth was watching indeed. The cliffs loomed high on either side, casting long shadows over their paths. But Eli felt safer here than in the open. No one could sneak up on them. In a place like this, that night, they made camp in a small hollow beneath a rock shelf. Wania started a small fire, using flint and dry moss. Eli prepared a simple meal of beans and jerky. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The kind of quiet that felt like understanding. Wania eventually spoke. "When I was a child, my father told me the world listens when we're still enough." Eli looked at her. "And what's the world saying now?" She smiled faintly. "It's waiting, like us." He stirred the fire with a stick. "I spent years thinking I was done living, done caring. Then a bleeding girl knocked on my door, and suddenly I find myself running through snow with a bow-wielding warrior who sleeps with one eye open." She laughed softly, the first time he'd heard her truly laugh. "You're not so quiet anymore," he chuckled. "You're not so wounded anymore." Their eyes met in the firelight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, from deep in the canyon, came the sound of hooves. Eli rose instantly, rifle in hand. Wania grabbed her bow, her eyes narrowing. Shadows moved beyond the trees, not 5 or 6 this time, more, but they didn't attack. Instead, a single rider emerged into the clearing. He wore traditional Apache garb, but his stance was regal, his face lined with age and wisdom. Behind him, more riders appeared, silent, still, their numbers growing. 30, 40, then more. Over 100 Apache warriors lined the canyon walls. Wania gasped. Eli stood still. Gun lowered. The elder dismounted and approached slowly, then stopped in front of them. Wania, he said, you are not forgotten. She stepped forward. Grandfather, he nodded once. You brought shame to those who hunted you, and you brought honor to the man who sheltered you. Then he turned to Eli. White man, he said calmly, you saved what was sacred to us. Eli glanced at Wania, uncertain. We are in your debt, the elder said, and you are no longer alone. The Apache warriors camped quietly that night around the canyon, their fires spaced evenly like stars fallen to the earth. Eli had never seen so many people sit so silently, no drunken boasting, no idle chatter. There was discipline in their movements, reverence in how they stacked wood, passed food, offered thanks to the land. Wania walked among them as if she'd never left. Eli watched from a distance. He felt like a stranger in a holy place. These people were family, blood, memory, spirit, and he was just the man with a cabin and a rifle who happened to open his door when someone knocked. By the time night had fully cloaked the canyon, the elder Wania's grandfather, Chief Atsa, summoned Eli to the largest fire. Wania stood beside the old man, wrapped in a new deerskin robe adorned with black beads. Her eyes shone with something Eli hadn't seen before, belonging. Chief Atsa gestured for Eli to sit. Your presence here, the chief began, was not expected, and yet it was written. Eli raised an eyebrow. Written where? Atsa smiled. In the earth, in the snow, in the choices we make. There was a long pause. You are not like the others, the elder continued. Most white men see only what they can take. You gave shelter without demand. You defended her life as if it were your own. Eli rubbed his calloused hands. Didn't feel like a choice. Girl was bleeding on my porch. But you chose not to fear her, Atsa said. That matters more. Another silence. Then Wania stepped forward. Her voice was clear, though it trembled. I told them what you did, Eli, about the food. The care, about standing in front of the rifleman instead of behind. Eli shifted uncomfortably. You're making me sound like a hero. I'm not. I just did what was right. Doing what is right when it's hard, that is heroism, she said softly. Atsa nodded. Tonight, we offer you protection. Our warriors will escort you anywhere, back to your cabin, beyond, wherever you wish to go. Eli looked around at the glowing fire, the silent faces, the starlit canyon full of warriors who had survived too much. I think I'm already where I need to be, he said. The chief smiled. Again, slower this time. Wania looked at him for a long moment. Then she walked closer, knelt by his side, and whispered, you don't have to be alone anymore. He swallowed hard. Atsa clapped his hands once, and from behind him, two men stepped forward with a bundle. They unwrapped it carefully, revealing a long, curved blade, a ceremonial Apache sword, polished and inlaid with turquoise along the hilt. This belonged to Wania's father, the chief said. A gift, now, to the man who protected his daughter. Eli reached out slowly, taking the weapon in both hands. It was lighter than he expected, yet powerful, balanced like something born from the land itself. I don't know what to say. You've already said it, Atsa replied. With your actions. Later that night, after most of the fires had dimmed, Wania found Eli standing alone under a twisted pine tree at the canyon's edge. You okay? She asked. He nodded. Just not used to this many people. Or gifts. She smiled gently. You've lived in silence so long, it probably feels like noise. He chuckled. It does. But not a bad kind. They stood in silence a moment. Then, she said, my grandfather wants to move the camp in 2 days. Up into the high mesa. It's safer, harder to reach. Eli nodded. Makes sense. I want you to come. He looked at her, surprised. She held his gaze. You have a place there, if you want it. Eli was quiet for a while. Then, you really trust me among your people. I bled on your porch. Eli, you could have let me die. You didn't. That means more than 1,000 words. He looked up at the stars, a breath escaping like smoke. All right, I'll come. Wania reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. The sun rose over the high mesa, painting the canyon walls in amber and gold. Eli had never seen the land from such a height before. From here, the world stretched endlessly, rolling plains to the east, snow-tipped peaks to the west, and below, the long, winding river that once marked the border between danger and safety. Now, it marked a beginning. The Apache had moved swiftly. Within 2 days, the camp had been dismantled, transported, and rebuilt atop the mesa. Tippas stood in neat rows, smoke curled gently from cooking fires. Children ran between pine trees, their laughter echoing across the cliffs. The warriors patrolled in silence, always alert, always respectful of the land. Eli found himself not just watching but helping. He hauled water from the spring each morning. He hunted with the younger scouts and taught them how to track deer, quietly, the way his own father had taught him. In the evenings, he repaired torn moccasins, strung new arrows, and listened to stories by the fire. Stories of ancestors, battles, spirits, and dreams. No one called him an outsider now. They called him to be, meaning he who stood before the storm. Still, the biggest change came from Wanya. She was no longer just the wounded girl who had once collapsed on his porch. She had become a leader. Her voice carried weight among the council. The warriors respected her skill with the bow. The women sought her advice. The children followed her like a shadow, clinging to her robes and laughing when she lifted them high. Eli watched her grow into herself with a quiet pride that surprised even him. One evening, just before dusk, Wanya found him sitting on a boulder overlooking the valley below. She joined him without a word, folding her legs beneath her, her deerskin robe fluttering in the wind. "You don't miss the cabin?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "I thought I would. I spent years thinking that place was all I had left, but now, it feels like a shell." She nodded. "Sometimes, we outgrow the places that saved us." They sat in silence for a while. Then she said, "My grandfather wants me to lead a small party north in the spring. There's word of scattered kin up near the Black Hills. Survivors, people hiding. You'll go?" Eli asked. "I think I should," she said. "They may need us, like I needed you." He looked at her for a long time. "Then I'll ride with you." Wanya smiled gently. "I was hoping you'd say that." The wind shifted. Far below, a herd of wild horses ran along the riverbank, their silhouettes cutting across the golden grass. It was a beautiful sight. Raw, free, unbroken. Eli turned back to Wanya. "You changed everything, you know?" She tilted her head. "Me, I was ready to disappear, to rot in silence. But now, He looked out at the setting sun. "Now I want more days like this. More mornings in the cold. More laughter by the fire. More reasons to keep going." She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "And you'll have them," she said, "as long as you keep choosing them." The last rays of sunlight caught in her hair, turning it copper and gold. For the first time in years, Eli felt something stir inside him. Not fear, not grief, but hope. A quiet, steady hope that maybe the worst was behind them. That night, around the fire, the tribe sang songs that Eli didn't yet know the words to, but he didn't need to. He sat beside Wanya, a carved flute in his lap, listening to the rhythm of drums that echoed the heartbeat of this new life. He wasn't alone anymore. He would never be alone again.